I don't like kind of canned speeches per se, so I have thoughts and ideas, and I want to figure out, I frankly, like everyone else, am also here to hear from Shirley, because she too is one of my heroes. So I realized, in regards to talking about human rights in Cuba, I can't tell you anything that she can't tell you firsthand. And then with John, who is, in my opinion, one of the human rights gurus in regards to Cuba, there's very little that I can tell you aside from what, in that regards, in regards to what's happening and the statistics and things of the sort. So I said, what unique aspect can I bring to this panel? And I thought, really I can express to you what I believe my concerns are. And my concerns basically from what I'm seeing, just down the block here on Capitol Hill, which is what my specialty is, and how all of us can contribute to, not only on this issue, but in regards to other ones, in bringing awareness. Because I think there's some fundamental dangers out there. And I have 5 of them, and I'm going to be very short with all of them, but I think they're very important. First and foremost is what we're here for today and what the victims of communism do, which is the danger to forget. The whole point here is that there's 100 million victims of communism. I mean, that's amazing. That's that's beyond imagination. And yet you don't hear about it as often. You don't, right down the block, there's a sense of, it's crickets. It's not something that we think about. But the most important part of that is that it's not history. We're not fighting about remembering the Armenian genocide, as important as that is. We're talking about things that are happening today in China, in Cuba, in North Korea, in Laos, in Vietnam. There's this danger to forget, but there's also a failure to recognize what is happening today. In Cuba, which is my specialty, since the announcement of President Obama, just this year alone, we've already seen over 6,000 political arrests in Cuba. Over 6,000. We're going to break just about every record of political arrest there's been in decades. Last year, there was over 8,500 political arrests. Compare that to 2010, when President Obama got to office, when there were just over 2,000. This year, there's easily going to be 4 to 5 times the amount of political arrests in Cuba. Last year, we saw religious persecution increase tenfold in Cuba. Over 250 churches demolished by the Cuban regime. There's a migration crisis. No one is talking about it. We have one of the greatest migration crises in our modern history taking place right now. Think about this. 1 out of every 139 Cubans are expected to arrive in the United States this year. They didn't get the message of hope and change. There's something that is going on. There's something that's wrong. There's something that they're fleeing. And I think that that's very dangerous. But I'd also like to say there's a bigger issue out here. And it's not just about, unfortunately, people forget that what brings these countries together, China, Vietnam, North Korea, Cuba, Laos, is that they're communist countries. But I'd also like to add to this, obviously, the fact of a similar behavior with Iran, similar behavior with Syria. And these things are getting worse. They're not getting better, they're getting worse. Unfortunately, and I think that, part of what I do is politics. And in politics, I'm concerned. Because on the flip side, we just had 55 million primary voters cast a ballot here in the United States. And of those 55 million primary voters, 26 million voted for either Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump. I'm not here to criticize any candidate, but essentially, these are candidates that think socialism is great, on one hand, and think that Putin is not a bad guy, on the other hand. Almost half the electorate think that that's okay. Almost half the electorate are questioning American exceptionalism. What would the world be like if it wasn't for America? That concerns me. I think that that's something that we need to realize. And again, something that this foundation does so much work on and is so focused on educating people about that. I think that's very important. So the danger to forget. 2, the danger of convergence. So, people have to sleep at night. Well, what makes you sleep at night? Well, I think there's this convergence of forces that concerns me also. And of course, I'm never going to be invited to speak here ever again, because I think sometimes that convergence is between these left-wing ideological forces that are out there. And unfortunately, because it's the opposite of what those stand for, all too often business interests, and I said I'm never going to be invited because we're at the business roundtable, so they're never going to. I'm going to get walked out, but not the business roundtable. They don't advocate for this. But sometimes business interests have converged in this regard, and we see this because sometimes big business doesn't like change; they like stability. And what more do dictatorships like than staying in power and stability? And we're seeing that. That's that shared, so that it becomes this shared goal of regime preservation. That's what's happening in China. I mean, the fact that you have protesters in Hong Kong go out to the streets, and you have the big 5 accounting firms take out an ad in international newspapers saying that they stand by the Chinese government against these students, where are our principles? Because there's this convergence. There's this convergence. I think that convergence is very dangerous. We see it every day. And in Cuba, that's where the administration's policy wants to take us. There's a role for the business community. There's a role for the Chamber of Commerce. There's a role for all of these things. But we shouldn't outsource our policy correctly, and we should make sure that there is a check and balance, because all too often these interests begin to converge, and that's something that concerns me greatly. The third danger is one of narrative and desensitization, I guess. And in that convergence, that danger is kind of the next step from the convergence, which is, I guess I was saying, what makes us sleep better at night? So, okay, so we have this convergence of forces, and regime preservation becomes the goal. Well, how do we justify that? Well, now the two narratives that help us sleep better at night is that it's okay because American culture and exposure to American culture is going to change everything. You know, that's the force. That's the force that changes everything. I can't tell you how many times members of Congress of both parties essentially tell me, well, you know, look, I mean, after all, didn't blue jeans and rock and roll bring down the Berlin Wall? And my response to that is, I don't think Eastern Europeans in 1989 wanted freedom any more than Hungarians in 1956, when rock and roll was just getting going. So I guess big band, I guess, was the influencing force. Or the Czechs in 1968, or anything of the sort. The difference in the 1980s, the difference in 1989, is that the Soviet Union was bankrupt. Is that they couldn't afford to put the tanks on the street anymore. But yet it makes us sleep better at night, saying we can wine and dine with these regimes. We can do everything because somehow American culture, as great as it is, I'm the #1 consumer, is going to somehow alone, without pressure, change things magically. I think it defies history. Then the second thing that this convergence of force helps sleep better at night is like, well, no, but economic reforms are going to lead to political reforms. Show me. When? We're not seeing it in China. We haven't seen it in Vietnam. But more than anything, it defies logic. You know, I always like to, my obsession, and I repeat this ad nauseum, so forgive me if you've heard me say this before, but the Magna Carta preceded the wealth of nations for a reason. The entire foundation of economic freedom, of markets, are based on individual rights, are based on those property rights, are based on those fundamental freedoms. You couldn't have the wealth of nations if you didn't have the Magna Carta. But it makes us sleep better at night. That's another concern that I have. The fourth is the danger of contagion. If America doesn't lead on these issues, no one else is going to. European nations, with the exception of some Eastern European countries and those countries that suffered firsthand from communism, aren't major defenders of human rights. They aren't going to lead that battle. They already are lax in doing so. our current policy is giving them even more of an excuse to be further lax. And we're seeing it play out already. I mean, first of all, moving aside from communism, when I see the administration promoting business in Europe for Iran, it makes you say, what's going on? They're doing the same with Cuba. It makes you really wonder what's going on. But here's what happens then. The European Union now is cutting a deal with the Cuban government. And that deal, which hasn't gotten much press, is being kept secret. They refuse to release the details of the deal that the European Union has cut with the Cuban regime for their normalization, quote unquote, different scale, of relations. And now why should they? If the United States cut a secret deal to get where we're at, the European Union is not going to be compelled to do anything different. So there's a danger of contagion in behavior. And finally, so I can shut up, is the danger of hemispheric backlash. You know, these models that we've generally accepted, be it in China, be it in Vietnam, and now that we want to accept in Cuba, you know, those are music to the ears of the regional autocrats. They're music to the ears of Castro. They're music to the ears of Maduro in Venezuela. And we see that today. We had done tremendous progress in the Western Hemisphere. In September 2001, 34 out of 35 nations signed the Inter-American Democratic Charter. I mean, it was historic. All of those military dictatorships, everything we've been through in the Western Hemisphere. Unprecedented. And yet, now, no one cares. No one's defending the Charter. And that's the current fight we're seeing down the street at the OAS. The Secretary General of Venezuela is trying to enact it, is trying to put pressure on the subversion of democracy in Venezuela. And yet, other countries of the region are trying to gut it, are trying to block him. And why shouldn't they? Because if I were Maduro, and I had that Machiavellian thought, and we wanted to accept, and the United States has the message that we want to accept this model, this China model, or this Vietnam model, etc., in the Western Hemisphere, and you accept Cuba as is, without any conditions, without any changes, the anomaly now becomes normal, well then why do we have to abide by the terms of the Charter? We've welcomed that. And the fact that this crisis is there, and you have, I mean, think about it, I'm going to end on this. We currently have Cuban military officials, and there's a list that just came out this week of their names. We know who they are, and we know everything, that are essentially running the government in Caracas, subverting democracy in Venezuela. And yet we hear, again, crickets. That would be unfathomable, you know? So that issue of hemispheric backlash is also of great concern. So I'm going to shut up on that point in that regards.
Thank you, Mauricio. As always, a provocative and accurate reflection of where we are at. Next, we will have Celé Avila León, who will talk about her plight. And Celé, por favor, adelante. I'll be translating simultaneously what she's saying.
Mi nombre es Celé Avila León, soy cubana y resido en Cuba. Fui electa delegada a la Asamblea Municipal del Poder Popular en Cuba por mis vecinos en junio del 2005, en el barrio campesino Limones, circunscripción número 37 del municipio Majibacoa, Las Tunas, provincia Las Tunas. La Asamblea, que es un órgano controlado en la práctica por el Partido Comunista de Cuba, en teoría debería ser la entidad que rige el país. La Asamblea estaba compuesta por 81 circunscripciones, con más de 50.000 habitantes. Desde el primer momento, en el seminario para el desempeño de las funciones como delegada, que duró 2 días, por mi carácter y condición de campesina, hice buena conexión con todos. Comencé a interesarme por la vida de los ciudadanos en general, que estaba tan dañada, que estas personas carecen de toda esperanza para salir de tanta miseria humana, espiritual y moral. Esto lo digo por lo que escuchaba en ese lugar, y las mismas frases las escuchaba en la calle. Esto no lo cambia nadie, no se arregla, pero no hay quien lo tumbe. Son expresiones recurrentes del pueblo. Desde las primeras asambleas percibí la doble moral de los dirigentes. En realidad no les interesaba el pueblo. Los mayores problemas eran burocráticos. Debido a tanta corrupción, el sistema no funcionaba.
My name is Surly Avila Leon. I am Cuban and reside in Cuba. I was elected as a delegate to the Municipal Assembly of People's Power in Cuba by my neighbors in June 2005 for the rural area of Limones, District Number 37, in the municipality of Mahivacoa in Las Tunas Province. The Assembly, which in theory is the entity that governs the country, in practice is controlled by the Communist Party of Cuba. The Assembly was composed of 81 districts with more than 50,000 inhabitants. From the beginning of the two-day seminar in which I learned how to exercise my functions as a delegate, I connected well with everyone on account of my character and my rural background. I began to become interested in the life of the citizenry in general, a life which is so damaged by the people's complete lack of hope of escaping from the human, spiritual, and moral misery which they suffer. I say this because of what I heard there and because of the things I've heard people say in the street. Quote, "No one is going to change this. It can't be fixed, but no one is going to knock it down either," end quote. These are recurrent expressions among the people. From the first meetings of the Assembly, I noticed the double standard of the leaders, who in reality were not interested in the people at all. The biggest problem were bureaucratic. Because of so much corruption, the system did not function. Adelante.
Conocí a las personas que votaron por mí que antes del 1992 la zona era una de las más productivas de la provincia. Existían 3 escuelas primarias, pero por el plan hidráulico ordenado por Fidel Castro, las habían demolido para construir un embalse de agua, quedando parte de la población desamparada.
I learned from the people who voted for me that before 1992, the area had been one of the most productive in the province. There had been 3 primary schools, but due to the hydraulic plan implemented by Fidel Castro, they had been demolished in order to construct a reservoir, which left part of the population destitute.
Los niños caminaban más de 9 kilómetros por caminos difíciles para asistir a la escuela más cercana. Los padres, por acompañar a sus hijos, no tenían tiempo de cultivar la tierra a pesar de la pobreza cruel en la que vivían. Algunos, por sacrificar menos a sus pequeños, emigraron a los poblados Calixto, Las Tunas y otros lugares donde existiera escuela, dejando las fincas abandonadas o con terceras personas, siendo afectados económicamente, pues los abastecimientos de alimentos tenían que comprarlo en su totalidad.
Children had to walk more than 9 kilometers on difficult paths in order to attend the nearest school. The parents, needing to accompany their children, had no time to cultivate their land, despite the cruel poverty in which they lived. To minimize the ill effects on their children, some immigrated to the towns of Calixto and Las Tunas and other places where there were schools, leaving their lands abandoned, and in some cases with third parties, affecting those who'd previously had been provided with food and now had to pay for all of their food needs. Adelante.
Por su condición de campesinos no tenían derecho a jubilación, teniendo que comenzar una vida laboral estatal, para la que muchos no estaban preparados intelectual ni físicamente. Era deprimente escuchar sus historias, confiando en la frase de Fidel Castro que promovía por los medios de comunicación sobre el concepto de revolución, de cambiar todo lo que debe ser cambiado. Di mi palabra a los campesinos de luchar hasta las últimas consecuencias para cambiarles su condición de vida. Ignoraba el monstruo que enfrentaría, sin darme cuenta todavía de la falta de derechos y la dictadura que existía en Cuba, capaz de todo por mantenerse en el poder y que miente en todo momento al decir públicamente que el poder emana del pueblo.
Okay. As farmers, they didn't have a right to retire and needed to begin state-controlled work, a life for which many of them were neither prepared physically or intellectually. It was depressing to hear their stories, trusting in the Fidel Castro quote that I often heard in the media, that revolution means changing everything that must be changed. I gave my word to the farmers that I would fight to change their situation, no matter the consequences. I was unaware as yet of the monster that I was facing, unaware of the lack of rights and the dictatorship that exists in Cuba, a dictatorship that is capable of anything in order to keep itself in power and whose claim that power originates in the people is a constant lie.
Me di a la tarea de reclamar la escuela que tanto necesitaba el barrio. Durante 6 meses acudí al municipio y a la provincia. En los primeros meses del 2006, sin resultado alguno, fui al Consejo de Estado. En ese mismo semestre se aprobó la construcción de la escuela. Para mi sorpresa, comenzaron a llegar a mí personas de todas partes, contándome sus problemas y queriendo que los representara. En una asamblea inmediata fui acusada por el presidente de la misma de ser líder, por reclamar envases para proteger y transportar los productos de los campesinos del municipio en general, y que se cumpliera el compromiso de comprarle el tomate, vegetales y frutas a los productores, que por su morosidad se pudrían en los campos, afectándolos económicamente, mientras el pueblo en todas las ciudades carecía de ello, sumido en hambruna. Dijo que se tenía que analizar mi conducta en la sede provincial del Partido Comunista de Cuba, y fui conducida de inmediato en uno de sus autos.
I set myself to the task of demanding the school that the area needed so badly. For 6 months, I went to the municipality and the province, during the first months of 2006 without any result. I went to the Council of State, and during that same semester, the construction of the school was approved. To my surprise, people from all around started coming to me, telling me their problems and asking me to represent them. In an immediate meeting of the Assembly, I was accused by its president of being a leader, for having requested containers to protect and transport the products of the farmers of the district, and for having demanded that the authorities fulfill their commitment to buy producers' tomatoes, fruits, and vegetables, which, because of delays in payment, were rotting in the fields, harming the peasants economically, while people in every city were plunged into famine. He said that my conduct would have to be analyzed at the provincial seat of the Communist Party of Cuba, and I was driven there immediately in one of their cars.
Comenzaron las campañas contra mí por parte del régimen, pero al mismo tiempo crecía la confianza del pueblo en mi persona. Se construyó la escuela y se inauguró en el curso escolar 2007-2008. Los dirigentes de la provincia nunca me perdonaron que se construyera. Me cuestionaban la forma en que me relacionaba con el pueblo. Mi preocupación por resolver la falta de pago a los campesinos, la vivienda de los casos críticos, sumida en la más cruel indigencia, la falta de seriedad en los compromisos con los campesinos en general. En el curso escolar 2010-2011, luego de funcionar 3 cursos, la escuela fue cerrada por decisión del gobierno, sin tener en cuenta las características del barrio por las que se construyó. Caminos intransitables, lejanía de la escuela más cercana al mismo y afectación económica de los padres, la cierran alegando que era una ley que venía de las altas esferas del poder.
Although the regime began campaigns against me, the people's confidence in me grew. The school was built and was inaugurated during the 2007-2008 school year. The provincial leaders never forgave me for its construction. They questioned the way in which I related to the people, my concern for resolving the lack of payments to the farmers, housing for critical cases, plunged into the cruelest indigence. The lack of seriousness and commitments to persons living in the countryside. During the 2010-2011 school year, after having been in operation for 3 years, the school was closed by a government decision, made without considering the characteristics of the area for which it had been built. Impassable roads, the distance to the nearest school, the economic condition of the local parents. Nevertheless, the school was closed, supposedly by a law that originated in the highest reaches of power.
No perdí tiempo. Reclamé en todas las instancias como está constituido, sin resultado. Busqué apoyo a las organizaciones de masas y políticas, todas organizaciones gubernamentales. Fui 12 veces al Consejo de Estado en 9 meses. porque los padres de los niños afectados decidieron no mandarlo a la escuela que le designaron, esperando la respuesta a mi gestión, y estaban siendo víctimas de amenazas y represión por parte del Ministerio de Educación y otras entidades como Atención a Menores, la Fiscalía, a todas las instancias, quiero que sepan que fueron esas organizaciones, la Policía Nacional Revolucionaria, Partido Comunista de Cuba, Poder Popular, fueron amenazados con quitarle los niños y albergarlos en una escuela especial de niños discapacitados, si no los llevaban a donde le destinaron. A los padres los amenazaron con llevarlos presos. Era una guerra psicológica, prohibiéndole reunirse conmigo, que era su delegada.
I lost no time. I made complaints according to the established procedure, but without results. I sought support in the mass organizations and political organizations, all governmental organizations. I went to the Council of State 12 times in 9 months because the parents affected had decided not to send their children to the school they had been assigned while awaiting the response to my actions, and had been victims of threats and repression on the part of the Ministry of Education, as well as other entities like Care of Minors, the Prosecutor's Office, the National Revolutionary Police, the Communist Party of Cuba, and People's Power. They were threatened with having their children taken away and housed in a school for disabled children if they refused to take them to their assigned schools. They threatened to take these parents' children prisoner, waging psychological warfare against them, prohibiting them to meet with me.
La última vez que fui al Consejo de Estado, al no lograr ser atendida por Raúl Castro o a alguien que él designara, me paré en una de las avenidas de la entrada al edificio, con el objetivo de que algún ministro se interesara y me atendiera. Pero no pasó mucho tiempo antes de que apareciera un ciudadano diciendo ser el jefe de seguridad del área del Consejo de Estado. Cuando le expliqué lo que hacía, me dijo que tenía que acompañarlo. Me llevó ante la jefa de atención a la población y fui expulsada y amenazada que si volvía al lugar sería acusada de atentar contra la seguridad del Estado.
The last time that I went to the Council of State, when I was not able to meet with Raul Castro or someone designated by him, I stopped in one of the avenues by the entry of the building, hoping that some minister would take interest and pay attention to me. Not much time had passed before a citizen appeared, claiming to be the chief of security for the area of the Council of State. When I had explained to him what I was doing, he told me that I would have to accompany him, and he brought me before the head of assistance to the population, and I was expelled and threatened that if I returned, I would be accused of crimes against state security.
Decepcionada y entre sollozos, fui para la redacción del periódico Granma, pidiendo que publicaran que en representación de la comunidad como delegada quería una entrevista con Raúl Castro o Ricardo Alarcón. A los días, la respuesta fue que no podían publicarlo. Las amenazas por parte del régimen, de los dirigentes de la provincia y municipio, no se hicieron esperar, instándome a renunciar a mi condición de delegada. A ver la firmeza con que defendía mis principios y posición, con el apoyo del barrio, hicieron maniobra para imponer a otra persona que el pueblo no apoyaba. Hicieron desaparecer la circunscripción que oficialmente yo representaba. Me amenazaron de tener que enfrentar un proceso fiscal.
Disappointed, sobbing, I went to the editorship of the newspaper Granma, asking them to publish that as a delegate representing the people, I wanted an interview with Raúl Castro or Ricardo Alarcón. They told me that they couldn't publish this. Threats on the part of the provincial and municipal leaders were not far behind, urging me to resign my position as a delegate. Upon seeing the firmness with which I defended my principles and position with the support of the area, they made moves to impose another person who was not supported by the people. They eliminated the district which I officially represented, and then they threatened to prosecute me.
Al estar segura de no haber cometido delito alguno, no lo pensé más y fui a Holguín en busca de periodistas independientes, a quienes no conocía, aunque había oído hablar de ellos. Quería denunciar al régimen por las violaciones de los derechos humanos que cometía. El 8 de septiembre del 2012 denuncié esta situación por Radio Martí. Me enfrenté sola al monstruo de la dictadura, que solo le importa el poder y los privilegios. No sé de política, pero la dictadura totalitaria de los Castro es una de las más corruptas y criminales del mundo. No pienso que haya un gobierno perfecto, pero estoy segura que involucrando todo el pueblo de casa en casa, podemos construir un gobierno con democracia y libertades y derechos constitucionales. Participé como activista en grupos de la oposición como la UNPACU y apoyé las huelgas de hambre de Luis Enrique Lozada, 23 días acompañando a su familia, y la de Ángel Junier, el crítico, en Granma. Decidí de forma independiente organizar a los que pensaran como yo, para defendernos del régimen y a la vez defender los derechos del pueblo y convencer a los que dudan que sí podemos cambiar la dictadura por un Estado de Derecho.
Certain that I had not committed any crime, I gave it no more thought and went to Holguín in order to search for some independent journalist whom I didn't know personally, but whom I had heard about. I wanted to denounce the regime for its human rights abuses. On September 8, 2012, I decried this situation on Radio Marti. I faced down the monster of dictatorship alone, which is interested only in power and privileges, all by myself. I don't know a lot about politics, but the totalitarian dictatorship of the Castros is one of the world's most corrupt and criminal. I don't think there is such a thing as a perfect government, but I am certain that by involving all people from house to house, we can build a government with democracy and constitutional liberties and rights. I participated as an activist in opposition groups like UNPACU, and I supported the hunger strikes of Luis Enrique Lozada, 23 days accompanying his family, and Ángel Junier, the critic, in Granma. I decided independently to organize people who thought like me so that we could protect ourselves from the regime and at the same time defend the rights of the people and convince those who doubted that we could indeed change the dictatorship into a state ruled by law.
Por todo lo dicho anteriormente, he sido víctima de varios atentados contra mi vida, intentos de eliminarme físicamente y otros hechos vandálicos contra mi finca, animales y propiedad, todos organizados por parte del régimen y su policía política. En sus intentos de eliminarme físicamente, la joven Judith Lady López Rodríguez me alertó que la policía política había ofrecido a presos comunes de alta peligrosidad recompensas por asesinarme. Ella fue asesinada el 26 de septiembre del 2014 por denunciarlo públicamente, después que yo sufriera un ataque donde quemaron mi cama en la madrugada. Su asesinato fue encubierto como un crimen pasional.
For everything that I have described above, I have been the victim of several attempts on my life. Attempts to physically eliminate me, and other acts of vandalism against my land, my animals, and my property. All organized by the regime and its political police as part of its intent to eliminate me. The young woman, Yudislady Lopez Rodriguez, alerted me to the fact that the political police had offered highly dangerous common criminals rewards for murdering me. She was killed on September 26, 2014, for publicly decrying an attack on me in which my bed was set on fire during the early morning. Her murder was covered up as a crime of passion.
El 24 de mayo del 2015 fui atacada en mi vivienda por Osmani Carrión, enviado por la seguridad del Estado para matarme. Me agredió con un machete, cercenándome la mano izquierda, mutilándome el brazo derecho y ambas rodillas. No me cortó la cabeza gracias a la presencia de un niño en el lugar de los hechos, y a Dios que protegió mi vida para poder estar aquí hoy y brindar mi testimonio. Estoy en los Estados Unidos con visa médica para tratarme las secuelas del último ataque sufrido, pero regresaré a Cuba en cuanto me recupere. Agradezco a todas las personas maravillosas que me han dado esta oportunidad.
On May 24, 2015, I was attacked in my home by Osmani Carrión, sent by state security to kill me. He attacked me with a machete, severing my left hand and mutilating my right arm and both knees. He didn't cut off my head thanks to the presence of a child at the scene of the events, and thanks to God who protected my life so that I could be here today and offer my testimony. I am in the United States with a medical visa in order to receive treatment for the most recent attack I have suffered, but I will return to Cuba as soon as I recover. I thank all the wonderful people who have given me this opportunity. Now, we've gone over 4 minutes, and I'll take that off my time, but without further ado, I'd like to introduce Julio Schilling, who will give his presentation.
There are two elements that are vital for a democratization process. Of course, after liberation, The first is dealing with the past, and the second is building democratic institutions for true regime change. 1989 was a very big year. In November, the Berlin Wall fell, and with it, it was the emblematic downfall of Soviet communism. I didn't say communism, I said Soviet communism. However, upon empirical scrutiny, 5 months earlier, in the biggest public square in the world, in Tiananmen, 3,000 people were butchered. And in that occurrence, in effect, Asian communism, the China model, this innovative, not really new system, because Lenin tried it in 1921 with his new economic policy, but the Chinese, in effect, perfected this system where you had a mercantile economy with market mechanisms and a Leninist state. This, in effect, crippled the hindsight of many people. Why? Because what had traditionally been marked, the free enterprise system, capitalism, as siding with democracy and centrally planned economies, siding with communist totalitarian dictatorships, all of a sudden blurred. This caused enormous confusion among Democrats in the world, unfortunately, and its ensuing moral relativism. The fascists, though, they had it right all along on this. In other words, they knew that property in private hands with a state that in essence dominated it would be much more efficient. Well, the socialism with Chinese characteristics, in effect, building on the pragmatic side of Marxism, in effect has done exactly that. But what we also saw from 1989 was despotism that competes in elections. We saw refurbished Marxists change names, change identities, but rule with the coexistence of private property, but with the state having the ability to, in effect, determine the outcome of who wins and who loses. Some call this Putinism, in the sense that Putin's dictatorship has, in effect, served as a model for this. In 1991, there were 21 states that officially divorced themselves from communist rule. 28. 13 years later, only 8 were full-fledged democracies. What happened? I mean, there were high expectations in 1989. What went wrong? Well, if we look at empirical evidence, and we can point to, for example, the work of political scientist Samuel Huntington, who claimed that there were waves historically of democratization. Waves like, we've all seen them and see they come, and then there's a reflux, there's an ebb that pulls it back, in essence reversing democratic achievements. These waves continued, throughout different sessions, and there were many reasons as to, people trying to explain, well, why do some fail and some don't? Others in the social sciences developed the notion of the modernization theory, that they called it. Seymour Martin Lipset, did great work on that, which in effect said, well, if you modernize a society, democracy's got to come. The notion is that as the economy expands, the economic class, the entrepreneurial class will put pressure on the political class to go into the sea of democracy. But the problem with that is that it completely misreads the qualitative difference in dictatorships from what is classically known as an authoritarian dictatorship and a totalitarian dictatorships. They're worlds apart. In regimes of total domination, civil society does not exist. So the theory of modernization is a moot point because there is no civil society. So who's going to put pressure on the political class if there is no entrepreneurial class that is not associated with the political power? And when we rightly look at the successful cases of democratization, we see Taiwan, we see South Korea, we see Greece, we see Brazil. But all these were authoritarian dictatorships. And then when we see the same model applied to totalitarian regimes, we see China, we see Vietnam, we see Laos. We see a dictatorship that is more strong than before, and a complicity of its society to a great degree because undoubtedly there is material betterment, and the choice between living in dire misery and not being able to express yourself, or living better and not being able to express yourself, well, it's an obvious choice. In the case of Cuba, what should be the requisites in a short time? Definitely, the economic order is of secondary importance. A little more state intervention, a little less state intervention. The importance, primacy lies in the political and the ethical system. And this has been, to a great degree, the problem which regimes such as the Chinese and the Vietnamese and the Cuban, and what we have in Russia, and what we see in many parts of the world, is that the economy and the commercial interest, which has been exposed before in this panel, in effect forms a collusion with a political power that can offer a certain stability, and democratic ethics goes out the window. And this is extremely, extremely dangerous. So for Cuba, the focus should be, as is the case for any country that wants to transition into democracy, focus on the political and the ethical. That's why this détente with the Castro regime is utterly meaningless if the purpose is democracy. Cuba will be free, however, but it will be in spite of the intentions of the Obama administration. There needs to be a systemic demolition. To be precise, decommunization. And there need to be laws that protect the nation of Cuba from parties and movements that are anti-system. This has worked fine in Europe. I mean, the Europeans have not been shy to put laws in the books that will keep Nazism out of the reach of power, and this makes perfect sense. As John Adams said, democracy is not a suicide pact. There's no reason that anti-system movements and parties should partake in the game of democracy. It is absolutely pointless and dangerous because democracy has to be defended. To be even more precise, in the Cuban context, there needs to be transitional justice. If there is no transitional justice, there can be no democratization. We have the evidence in Central and Eastern Europe that will validate this. Transitional justice is not wild vengeance. It is designed to avoid impunity, because if you know that you can commit a crime and not be held accountable for it, it will be repeated down the road. So to avoid this, impunity cannot be tolerated, as it was not tolerated in Europe after the collapse of fascism. Transitional justice requires 1, the identification of the crime, 2, punishment for the criminals, and 3, reparations for its victims. As part of the comprehensive decommunization that Cuba would need, its institutions need to be put away. Hannah Arendt explained very lucidly that the success of totalitarian regimes is in its ability to organize political power in society. The system is maintained by a host of institutions, mass organizations, labor organizations, an array of, in effect, arms of the dictatorial state that try to mimic a civil society, but in effect are just instruments of the political power. This needs to be dismantled. The regime has enormous businesses outside the territory of Cuba, which have in effect siphoned money away from the Cuban people. These needs to be investigated. These assets need to be found. This cannot be understated because, again, impunity cannot be tolerated, and all these companies, I mean, just recently, what's known as the Panama Papers continue to reveal to the extent that a criminal regime like the Cuban goes to, in order not just to survive, but to profit, because the notion of equality is completely hypocritical, as as we all know, and has the higher leadership of the Cuban regime demonstrates. There needs to be an establishment of an indemnification fund, because victims have to be indemnified. Ley has to be indemnified. So many others. People whose property was stolen need to be indemnified. Now, I want to be clear, no one should be taken out of their house if they're currently there. However, we cannot sanction what is in effect the biggest robbery of American property in the world. And not just because it's American property, but because it's wrong. So to the extent that this indemnification fund can afford it, this must be done because, again, we cannot sanction theft. There are certain particularities in the ugliness of Cuban communism that so often misses the radar of many of the brightest that are on the side of liberty. Cuba's nature is all-encompassing and has played an enormous role throughout its history in keeping communism well and alive. The notion of the new left, this was essentially fathered by Cuba, where you had the Soviet Union looking at the proletariat, the working man as the agent of change, and the Chinese, well, they had the peasant as the agent of change. The Cuban Revolution, in effect, said, no. Anybody, as long as they share these sentiments, intellectual, so forth, it opened the door to agents of change, which in effect attracted an enormous amount of people into this movement. Communist Cuba has been the base for the class war struggle in Latin America, has been and continues to be. Communist Cuba has been the bridge with radical Islam. This marriage that you see of convenience between atheist communism and radicalism, it was Cuba that opened the door. Enjoying meetings with Ayatollah Khomeini years before he was in power, while he was still in Paris. The decolonization effort in Africa. Cuba managed to penetrate all these independence movements and attract them towards the communist sphere. When Soviet communism collapsed, Cuba's response was the Sao Paulo Forum, and in effect, bringing together the movements of the left and changing strategy, adopting Antonio Gramsci's superior system, because it must be said, the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci, his biggest disagreement with orthodox Marxists was, he said economics is not primacy, culture is. Let's focus on impacting culture and penetrate the democratic institutions, and we'll get to power that way. Well, this is what the Sao Paulo Forum was all about. In effect, invigorating communist subversion with different methodology. The so-called socialism of the 19th century is in effect that in motion. You cannot speak today about Venezuela, about Nicaragua, about Ecuador, about Bolivia, about Brazil, without understanding the part that Communist Cuba plays. Venezuela is a Cuban colony. So it is important not just for the people of Cuba that Cuba take the correct road and implement this decommunization. It is important that all this information in a free Cuba be not just made public, but the criminal activity of all those accomplices outside of Cuba's borders. There are victims of Cuban communism all over the globe. I mean, it's no secret American POWs that were tortured and killed by Cubans, that were taken back to Cuba because they were in such horrific state that they could not be returned when the Paris Peace Accords took place. In closing, I cannot understate the importance that if we want to truly conclude the global recession and promote democratic recovery, Cuban communism must be completely demolished and overhauled and transitioned to democracy. It is not just an island 90 miles from here that has a disagreement with the U.S. government. It truly is a focus of evil that impacts the world. And Victims of Communism is an important organization that I think has a great role in this, because the promotion of amnesia is what the defenders and the apologists for these regimes want to promote. I commend the work that you do, and I think that not just looking at the systems that remain, but the subversion that is still waiting to occur if this is not stopped with time. Thank you so much, and God bless.
Thank you, Julio. I'm going to try to be brief, and I share with Julio his concerns about the international impact that the Castro regime has shown over the last 57 years. And let me just go over very quickly. First off, Mauricio spoke about the migration crisis that's ongoing. More than 70,000 over the past year alone fleeing from Cuba to the United States. What's interesting is we've seen these migration patterns before, and normally they've coincided with efforts of the United States to normalize relations with the dictatorship. We saw it in 1979, 1980 with Jimmy Carter with the Mariel boat lift. We saw it again in the mid-90s, in 1994, 95, during the Clinton administration's normalization efforts with the dictatorship. And now we're seeing it again with the Obama administration's normalization efforts. The question is why? I think it's twofold. One, the dictatorship wants to export those people that are disaffected, and there are administrations in place that tolerate it. The Bush administrations, the Reagan administration was understood that if they tried to do a mass exodus, that would be viewed as something negatively affecting U.S. interests and could have consequences for the Castro regime. But secondly, during these efforts at normalizations of relations with the dictatorship, of détente with the Castro regime, there has been a worsening human rights situation in the country, which has led people to want to flee the country on those three occasions. So that's another common pattern. The convergence of forces, of the left-wing ideological forces with business interests, that's something that's been seen around the world for many decades with regards to Cuba, and the U.S. sort of sat that out, which is one of the reasons that until this present year, the United States was so popular in Cuba with the Cuban people, because they viewed the U.S. as a country that was on their side. that may be changing now with this new relationship because they see the U.S. no longer as a friend of the Cuban people, but a friend of the Castro family, and perhaps assisting in that succession. President Obama, in addition to meeting with Raul Castro, was also meeting with Alejandro Castro, a 50-year-old colonel of state security who's being groomed to be the successor. And this may be something we'll be seeing in the next couple of years. And if that's what the Obama administration has achieved, as the Clinton administration stabilized the regime in the 1990s and gave it another 20 years of life, it will not be remembered fondly by Cuban Democrats. We heard about Venezuela and the horrors there and the role that the Cuban military and the Cuban state security apparatus is playing. We also heard about the relationship in the Islamic world. But one of the episodes that gets very short shrift is Cuba's role in Africa. In the 1970s and 80s in Ethiopia, with Mengistu Haile Mariam, who's a war criminal who helped to precipitate a famine in which over 1 million people died. Fidel and Raul Castro and thousands of Cuban troops played an active role in that. There are actually photographs of Fidel and Raul Castro reviewing troops in Ethiopia and giving advice on how to best repress. And I personally, in the 1990s, on a train ride through Eastern Europe, actually 1990, right, when the changes were taking place, I was able to sit and talk with the Ethiopian economist who described to me how Cuban troops would surround the cities where there were grain stores to pick up the starving farmers that were coming in from the countryside and then take them back out into the desert to die. Now, you don't hear too much about that. Over 1 million people died in that famine. Thousands of children were massacred in a Red Terror that was facilitated by Cuban troops. And Swedish human rights organizations were condemning it at the time. I'd also like to address what they've been doing internationally, because not only is the human rights situation deteriorating in Cuba, the human rights situation around the world has been deteriorating over the last decade. I mean, think about that for a moment. And let's focus on a couple of instances. March 28th of 2008, Castro's Cuba, together with the Organization of the Islamic Congress, were able to pass resolutions at the UN Human Rights Council undermining international free expression standards. We're not talking about Cuba anymore, we're talking the world. February 2nd, 2009, during the Universal Periodic Review of China, the Castro regime's recommendation to China was to repress human rights defenders in China more, that they weren't doing a good enough job. That was at the UN Human Rights Council. And under this current administration, on July 15th of 2013, in Panama, a North Korean flagged ship from Cuba was captured with tons of weapons, including ballistic missile technology. And while the Obama administration was negotiating its normalization of relations with Cuba in 2014, Cuba managed to get its hands on a U.S. Hellfire missile and not return it until after it became news in the press just this past year. I mean, this is what's taking place currently. It's having an impact internationally, it's having an impact on U.S. national security and safety, and in U.S. interests in terms of a new mass migration. And internally inside of Cuba for the democratic opposition, these last 10 years have been horrible, especially the past 6, 7 years under President Obama. We saw in the beginning, he made an outreach in 2009 saying that they wanted to have a new relationship. The regime responded by taking an American hostage, Alan Gross. The administration kept quiet for about a month or so until it broke in the news and then started continuing to loosen relations with the dictatorship and start requesting the return of Mr. Gross, but that was it. And that sent a green light to the dictatorship. We saw in 2010 the death of Orlando Zapata Tamayo, an Amnesty International prisoner of conscience on hunger strike. Pro forma complaint from the US, but not much more. In 2011, the leader of the Ladies in White, Lara Poyan, died under suspicious circumstances in a Cuban hospital shortly after her movement had succeeded in getting political prisoners released, but rather than disbanding, had redefined themselves as a human rights movement that would carry on until they changed Cuban laws, like what Celia Avila talked about doing, which cost her so much. And then we saw in 2012, Osvaldo Payá Sardiñas, founder of the Christian liberation movement. They carried out an initiative which to date has managed to mobilize more than 30,000 Cubans to sign their names, to give their identity numbers, calling for democratic reforms and human rights demands, murdered along with a youth leader, Harold Cepero, on July 22nd of 2012. Sadly, this isn't something new. We've experienced it before. In the mid-90s, when the Clinton administration was looking to normalize relations, there were massacres of Cubans trying to leave the island. There was the shoot-down of the Brothers to the Rescue planes, a civil society group out of exile that was saving the lives of thousands of Cuban rafters back then. And the normalization agenda, what it ended in was a worsening human rights situation, tragedies of human rights activists being murdered, and an exodus that affected negatively the interests of U.S. taxpayers. And we saw it again in the 70s with President Carter, a worsening human rights situation. The acts of repudiation, the rapid response brigades came into existence in the late 70s with Mariel, where people were physically assaulted and attacked just because they wanted to leave Cuba. At the same time, though, we must remember, and this is an important anniversary in 2016, 40 years ago on January 28th, 1976, Cuban dissidents gathered together. Ricardo Bofill, a university professor, Marta Fraide, who'd been the representative of the Castro regime in Paris of UNESCO, and other activists to found the Cuban Committee for Human Rights. For the first time in Cuba's history in its resistance against the Castro regime, in the early 60s there had been a violent resistance that had been extinguished and massacred in the hills of the Escambray by 1966. But 10 years later, these human rights activists got together and started looking at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, inspired by the Helsinki Accords, and began to document the human rights abuses. Many of them returned to prison, but they continued documenting from the prisons. Men and women that had fought with Fidel Castro against the previous dictatorship, individuals like Gustavo Arcos, Sebastián Arcos Bernis, joined this organization. And they paid a high price. Sebastián Arcos Bernis, similar to what happened with Lara Pollán, was arrested for advocating nonviolent change, for advocating a national dialogue, had a cancer that could have been easily identified, diagnosed. Doctors were not allowed to diagnose it. One doctor actually took pity on him and falsified a record with a different name, and the diagnosis came back that he had cancer, and that led to an international campaign that led to his release, but it was too late. He died a short while later, but not before he was able to address the UN Human Rights Council. All I want to say is that this struggle has been carried out by Cubans going back decades. It continues today. We see it in the works of the Christian liberation movement that through the Varela Project now has something called the People's Path, which seeks a democratic transition. We see it with Dr. Oscar Elias Pisset, who's these days in Washington, D.C. with Project Amelia, that recognizes that the regime is a brutal communist regime that does not concede even one atom of freedom, that it has rigidly and arbitrarily resisted any changes that would ensure a decent life for the Cuban people, and that nonviolence and nonviolent resistance is the only way to challenge that type of regime. We see it in the Forum for Rights and Freedom, launched by the Todos Marchamos, the We All March campaign, that each Sunday, hundreds of citizens march in the streets of Cuba, nonviolently through Havana, other cities of Cuba, demanding a general amnesty for political prisoners and free elections, and they're met with brutal repression. That's part of those 8,600 from last year that were detained, and those 5,000 plus so far this year. There's also the Unity of Democratic Action Board, the MOD, which has unveiled another 18, which is trying to insert itself into the vote that will be taking place in 2018 and try to change the electoral law. These are just 4 initiatives of many. They've gathered some attention internationally, but it demonstrates that the Cuban people have a desire to be free. They're working towards it, oftentimes at great cost to their physical safety and often their lives, as we've heard the testimony from Soleil Avila Leon today. So I thank you for your attention. I thank you for listening to us and look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.